Welcome to our chapter about subdivision and displacement. If we look at what we got here, we've got a render of a board, and this board is from our main image that is the cover. And I've just got a tileable texture slapped on this guy. Let's graph this. There we go. You can see it's just a photograph of some wood. Let me get it pulled over here. So there's our banging wood texture, which looks great. And it's going through some remap ramps, so it's really just kind of getting a little bit of specular on this. Very little. Wood is really not very shiny. I'm just assuming it's got a little, I want a little bit of shimmer on it. And then that's really it. It's got a bump map, just using the same file texture, give it a little bit of tooth across it. But, the main thing that we can see here is that this board is really not looking the way that it needs to look yet. So we're going to be examining how to apply its displacement map. This was sculpted in ZBrush. Let me see if I can pull that up here. There we go. So you can see this is what our board is going to look like, with a whole lot of extra detail, which is going to look much, much better. And then hopefully the tileable texture. For now, we'll just kind of go across the surface of it, but eventually we would want to actually go in and hand paint this for real. So let's go ahead and first talk about subdivision before we really get into displacement. So subdivision in V-Ray can be handled very differently than simply pressing 3. So it's just like Mental Ray has the approximation editor, and Arnold has its own way of handling subdivision as well. V-Ray is no different. It's highly recommended that you don't rely on pressing 3, and there's a good reason for that. It's really because if I'm pressing 3 on every object, you can actually see up here in my poly count. I guess it's not changing, but in general, what's actually happening in your viewport? I thought this updated when you pressed 3, but I guess it doesn't. You are having to visualize your number of subdivisions, and that's really not what you want to be happening all the time. If I have a scene that's got 10 million polys and I need to press 3 on everything to make sure that it's subdivided, I'm going to get myself into a lot of trouble when it comes to just opening the file and tumbling the camera around inside. Selecting objects is going to be slower. Adding objects to render layers, pretty much everything inside Maya is going to be slower, and that's really the opposite of what we're trying to do here. So let's go back to pressing 1. So first things first, in your shape node, the simplest way to just go ahead and add some subdivision is going to be on your geometry shape. You can just go to Attributes, V-Ray, and simply add a subdivision attribute. If I go into this attribute down here, you can see that it has some options for subdividing UVs, and it will simply go into your render globals here, and it will look at this default displacement and subdivision set of attributes, and it will smooth based off of what you've got right here. So now if I go ahead and render just this little chunk here, you can see that it's all nice and rounded off and not really looking fantastic by any means, but it's for sure subdividing, which is good. Something new in V-Ray 3 is actually the added open subdiv. Open subdiv is Disney and I don't remember if it's Pixar or Disney, but it's one of the two. I believe it's Pixar's subdivision method. So in theory, hopefully one day all applications will be using open subdiv, and that means that all applications will subdivide polygons the same way, meaning that if I render an explosion in, say, Houdini, and then my main beauty render is in V-Ray and everybody's using open subdiv, holdouts would match perfectly the same, or very, very close, closer than they do now without open subdiv. So you can see if I turn on open subdiv, it has its own set of attributes. You can see this depth is just simply the amount of times that it subdivides. Just a fair warning, this may, hopefully this will be fixed by the time this video comes out, but as it is right now, open subdiv does slow down some scenes, and believe there's already been bug reports filed about it, but Hopefully by the time this video comes out, that'll all be fixed. But if you go in and add open subdiv to your scenes and you feel like there's a really intense slowdown or it's not even rendering at all, that could be the culprit, and you may want to go back to just your regular subdivision. Probably not a good idea to have both either. Don't know what that's going to do. Probably just subdivide it twice. So cool. That's looking good. And what's pretty cool about this being an attribute form here, so you can see if I had to go in and say assign this subdivision attribute to every single shape node in my scene, that could get a little bit tedious, to say the least. So let's turn that off here. And let's just create a couple little cylinders down here just to prove a point. There we go. And all of these objects, let's say I want to get smoothed. So V-Ray has a node called V-Ray Displacement. And even though it is called V-Ray Displacement, and we're going to be using it for displacement in just a second, you can also use it to just bundle subdivision attributes onto a selection of objects. They function as a Maya set node, and it's under create V-Ray. V-Ray displacement. I can say apply single V-Ray displacement node to selection. And if I switch over my outliner here, you can see that I now have a new V-Ray displacement node right here. So let's just call this general subdivision. And I can add attributes to this just like I did on the shape node. You can see they're a little bit more limited now, but I do have the main 4 that deal with subdivision. So I can just add a regular old subdivision. And now any objects that are inside of that, they will go and get the same subdivision. So you can also add group nodes to that. A lot of times what ends up happening is there's kind of random objects that have displacement, so it does take a little bit of thought. But if none of your objects are actually displacing, like maybe all of these cylinders, for example, I could just drag and drop this whole group into this general subdivision node right there, and now they're all going to subdivide. So cool. And let's actually go ahead and delete those. That's really the main bulk of how you're going to be subdividing your objects. It's really highly recommended that you use these V-Ray displacement nodes. They're very easy to see in your outliner as well, which is really beneficial in larger pipelines. You can also export these. You can, if you have an asset going through an asset management system, you can send the V-Ray displacements with it. So like if a character had a whole bunch of displacements on it, it'd be really easy to see all of the subdivision and how it's happening. So maybe if a character was a hero asset in one scene, I could go ahead and have the subdivision on, and then if it was super far away in another, I can just turn off that render as subdivision surface, and then all the smoothing on those assets would be off. So it's really helpful in that sense. And part 2 of the way it kind of handles general working is going to be with actual displacement. So let's actually, let's take our board here, and I'm just going to open up my node editor. And that board, the way I'm going to break this connection, you can see that board, this has a little connection to general subdivision. I'm just going to break that so that it's out of there. So it is worth mentioning that I could go to create V-Ray displacement. I could remove V-Ray displacement from selection. So for example, I can select all of my cylinders since they're already in the group, and I can say create V-Ray, remove V-Ray displacement from selection. There we go. And now only that group is in there that's going to get that smoothing, and anything that goes into this group is going to get that smoothing. So this is the cylinder group. So if I even duplicated and had a couple new cylinders in this group, they're all going to inherit the same subdivision. So you can see how powerful this is. And I guess that, oops, I forgot that I actually turned it off. Tripped me up for a second. Thought that my group node wasn't working. And there we go. There we go. Now you can see we've got our subdivided cylinders, our two new ones, and the unsubdivided board. Let's go ahead and keep our scene organized here. Let's get our board hooked up with our displacement map from ZBrush. So I'm going to add a new V-Ray displacement node. Go to Create V-Ray Displacement, apply single V-Ray displacement node to selection. We'll just call this one, this is board 5, displace. There we go. And I'm going to bounce over to my node editor here. And here's our board 5 displace. Let's, I guess, shrink that down, try and make the most out of our space here. The main thing to note in our displacement is that we do have a texture input here. If you really wanted to, just so you know, before we get into the V-Ray displacement node, you can hook in a displacement directly into the texture here as well. Again, I don't really recommend doing that because it's kind of nice just having all of it be on these V-Ray displacement nodes. So I actually very, very rarely use it through the hypershade like that and connect a displacement to the shading group. I now greatly prefer to just have it live on the geometry level via these sets. So let's bounce back over to our node editor here. And let's get our, there we go. And I'm going to create a file texture. And let's load in my displacement texture, which is going to be in the bridge scene planks. Here's our displacement. Cool. And if I look at this, I believe I've got nuke here somewhere. This is the displacement texture for the board. This is a 32-bit displacement, and you can see that the midpoint value is set to black. This is definitely the preferred method for using displacements coming from ZBrush. You can also see that the values go above 1 and also dip below 1. Let's get rid of that nuke. So all I have to do is drag and drop that displacement, and this is normal how Maya thinks it thinks it's displaying it correctly for you, but it's not anyways. I just drag and dropped that EXR directly into this displacement material file texture override. And now I need to add the displacement attributes. So I'm going to go to Attributes V-Ray. I'm going to add both displacement control and I'm going to add subdivision and displacement quality. The last thing I need to do with 32-bit displacements coming from ZBrush in this format, I do need to go to my file texture here and say Attributes V-Ray, allow negative color. What that does is simply make it so that V-Ray reads negative colors in EXR. I don't know why it doesn't do that by default. It probably should, but anyways, that's okay. So let's give ourselves a quick test render here. Ta-da! We're getting some displacement. You can actually see if I tilt my camera up a little bit here, it's successfully breaking up that edge a little bit. You can see none of that detail's really in there. And it's working as intended. So it's pretty cool. And now let's talk about how to tune some of these settings a little bit. It's not really too great. One thing to note with objects coming from ZBrush, it is pretty important to make sure your normals are smoothed. Let me just go ahead and soften edge, delete history. Let's watch what happens if I have hardened edges. And we can actually just hide those cylinders now just to save on some time. So V-Ray gets pretty wacky. You can see the faces are all separating off from each other. So hardened edges or hardened normals actually signify to V-Ray to when it's subdividing to do exactly what you see here, where the faces just kind of separate off one another and they're not connected. If you do want hard normals, which comes up every now and again, especially with hard surface kind of stuff, you can go in and there's a flag here on my displacement for keep continuity. And that will make it go in and it will attach and make sure these faces are still stuck together, even though V-Ray is kind of forcing itself to shove them apart. So that's looking pretty good. And now I'm actually just going to soften those normals again because I do want the softened edges. We can even test just this little bit here. So cool. And let's go ahead and let's give this a little bit more subdivisions to play with. So we talked about our global settings before where there's the edge length and max subdiv. It's a very similar setup for displacement. But with displacement, I actually prefer to turn off the view dependent checkbox and set the edge length to 0.001. Actually, I guess that's similar to how I do the global settings. And then I just have full control over how many times this subdivides. So in this case, in my ZBrush file, this went up all the way to level 7. I do know that I exported the level 2 geometry though, so maybe I just want this to be at, say, 6. Whoa, not 40, 6. And now let's go ahead and give that a nice test render. And so notice that it thought a little bit more in the very beginning there. It's totally normal. That's the actual geometry getting subdivided. If you have a really long lag at the beginning of your render, you could have too much subdivision. It's kind of easy, especially with assets coming from ZBrush. Like if I set all of my assets to 6 subdivisions, it would get pretty slow pretty quickly. So let's actually go in and I can even add a render element here. Well, let's just assign a just really quick V-Ray material just so you can see what the displacement's actually doing in this particular case. So it's actually looking pretty good and seems to pretty much look exactly like my sculpt, which is always nice when that happens, kind of first try. Sometimes there's a lot of back and forth that you have to deal with, but just so you guys can see the settings from ZBrush to kick out a displacement map. This is probably good for another video, but if you go to your multi-map exporter, I do have subdiv level 2 turned on. The map size is set to 4K. And if I go to my displacement map settings, you can see these as well. Mid-0 32-bit EXR. And I also do turn on this 3-channel format because it makes it easily readable inside of Maya. When it's set to just 1 channel, it gets a little funky. Maya doesn't really know what to do with it. Even Photoshop gets a little weird with it. Nuke reads it fine, but anyways, I like to just turn on 3 channels, so it's just a standard RGB image. And the other thing that I do with these displacements is I do, if this is the object, and this is exactly how it came in to ZBrush, you do want to set your scale and intensity to 1. And that makes it so that when, in this case, I didn't really scale this at all. This is just the size of the object. It's in real world scale, and it seems to work pretty nicely. If you're ever dealing with a 16-bit displacement, there is a option. So if you've ever seen a 16-bit displacement, instead of a 32-bit where the midpoint is 0, the midpoint on a 16-bit displacement is usually 50% gray. So if I bring this guy back over, all of this area and through here would be 50% gray, and then anything displacing down would be black or darker values, and anything displacing up would be lighter values. And if that's the case, you do need to use this displacement shift attribute. So you could say if my displacement right now was going up by 1, I would want to displace my shift my displacement by negative half the amount. So this would be negative 0.5. If I was doing a displacement excuse me, displacement amount of 3, I would want this to be negative 1.5. So cool. And let's give this one more test render. So cool. So that's really kind of the summary of the displacement attributes. If you want, you can do you can play around with this enable water level. It's another kind of funky, you can see that will actually mask polygons based on where they are in the displacement. You can actually use it to do some kind of creative effects. If you wanted to have like water masking in a canyon or something like that, or if you want to do something a little bit more abstract, like say if I set this displacement, the water level here, maybe to 0.5, it'll just start trimming out more and more of those polygons. So actually it's kind of cool. It's just only the edges of this board now. So it's kind of some interesting stuff. But that's really kind of the extent of it. So we really like to do all of these subdivisions and displacements on these V-Ray displacement nodes. And they really have made the workflow and just general life dealing with really heavy amounts of this type of thing much, much easier now. So it's pretty cool. And that's about it. So we'll be heading onward to the next chapter. Thank you.